There's been a lot of discussion about data and privacy and regulation under the Privacy Act of the handling of data. I thought I'd say a couple of things about this. First of all, I'll talk about the law today. And secondly, I'll say something briefly about the proposed law reform changes that will possibly come into effect in Australia in the next 12 to 18 months. If you've got a data set with 5 or 6 data points in it, it is very clear that you cannot simply delete the individual's name and by doing that avoid regulation under the Privacy Act. And the reason for this is because the Privacy Act regulates the handling of personal information, which is defined as information about identified individual or an individual who is reasonably identified. So in my example with multiple data sets, if you just pull out the name of an individual and somebody else collects the data set without that name, that does not mean that the collector of that data set is not collecting personal information. And the reason for this is because there is the prospect of personal information or data being re-identified, to reconnect it with Mary Smith, for example. The Australian Privacy Commissioner has a detailed paper on de-identification under the Privacy Act, which examines this whole concept of re-identification risk and whether or not something in the hands of an organization is truly de-identified and not personal information. This has a strong statistical and scientific aspect to it as well, which is why the Australian Privacy Commissioner some years ago combined with the Australian Scientific Industrial Research Organisation, known as CSIRO, to prepare a scientific paper on the de-identification decision-making framework, i.e. making it clear that the whole concept of whether something is or is not personal information is not just a simple yes or no answer. As of today, it's not a simple exercise to de-identify data and therefore take it outside the ambit of regulation under the Privacy Act. Let's talk a little bit about this review that I mentioned. The February 2023 review released by the Australian Attorney General. For our purposes, it's important that they suggest a couple of things. First of all, as I said, the definition of personal information talks about personal information about an identifiable individual or an individual who is reasonably identifiable. There is a proposal to change about to relates to. And what the Attorney General has said is that it's not intended to substantively expand the definition, but there is a need to clarify that certain types of technological data does amount to personal information relating to an individual. And the examples that have been given are things like IP addresses, device identifiers, and location data. So that's really something important to keep in mind. That's the first takeaway as to what might be coming in the next 12 to 18 months in Australia. Secondly, there is a proposal to regulate certain activities, even though it may not concern the handling of personal information. And what I mean is this. In the EU and the UK at the moment, there are detailed rules about targeting individuals, and the targeting organization might not know who the actual individual is. They might not know it's Jane Smith, but if they do know that they're targeting someone in a particular demographic, for example, someone who's between 30 and 40 years of age, who is looking to buy a property in the western suburbs of Sydney, and they're targeting that individual with that attribute, That is regulated under the GDPR in the EU and also regulated under the data privacy laws in the UK, as I understand it. And if the proposals go ahead in Australia as planned, that will be the case in Australia also. So in other words, the Privacy Act will regulate profiling and targeting in particular scenarios, even though the data that is being handled by the organization is not personal information. There's much more to come, but I just thought I'd give you this taster on data and privacy and what the position is in Australia today and what's likely to happen in the next 12 to 18 months. Thank you very much. All the best.